The 6950 XT is AMD's most powerful GPU they've ever built. Well, that is at least until the 7900 XTX is released on December 13th. So how does it handle VR? Just how high can you set the graphics in VR games? Can you max everything out? Well, let's take a look and see. In Beat Saber, I was able to max everything out. I set the render resolution in the Oculus app to 5408 by 2736, the refresh rate to 120 Hz, and maxed out all the in-game settings. I did turn anti-aliasing off though, because with the resolution cranked this high, having it on actually makes games look worse. At these settings, the 6950 XT breezed right through this game with a rock-solid 120 FPS and the performance headroom hovering around 50%. Oh, by the way, for this video, I used the PowerColor RX 6950 XT Red Devil, and paired up with it is the Ryzen 7 5800X, 16 GB of Corsair Vengeance 3600 MHz CL16 DDR4 RAM, and the headset I'm using is the Oculus Quest 2. Yeah, that's right. I'm not going to call it Meta. That name is stupid. Another game the 6950 XT crushed was Contractors. Again, I set the render resolution in the Oculus app to 5408 by 2736, the refresh rate to 120 Hz, and with all the in-game graphics options set to ultra, except for anti-aliasing, which I set to low, the 6950 XT kept us at 120 FPS, with even more performance headroom left over than we had in Beat Saber. Even in Parking Lot, which is a map I've found has areas that are quite a bit more taxing on the GPU than most other maps, the 6950 XT still crushed it. One of the best looking standalone Quest 2 games is Red Matter 2, and on PC, it looks even better. For this game, I was able to keep the refresh rate at 120 Hz, but did lower the render resolution a bit to 4704 by 2384. In the game's graphics options, I set the resolution scale to 1.6 and turned indirect and dynamic shadows both on. Looking at our FPS and performance headroom graphs, you can see the 6950 XT handled these settings really well in this game. Gameplay was smooth and the graphics looked absolutely gorgeous. If you're into racing games, this next test should be of interest to you. In Assetto Corsa, I kept the render resolution at 4704 by 2384, but did bump the refresh rate down to 90 Hz. The thing that impressed me in this test was the 6950 XT was able to max out all the in-game video settings at this resolution and refresh rate. I set the in-game resolution to 4096 by 2160, and everything else as high as they could go. The only settings in the game I didn't mess with was the view settings, and I left those at their defaults. With as much performance headroom as we still had left, I probably could have pushed the refresh rate or render resolution up further, but in a fast-paced game like this, I prefer to have a rock-solid frame rate with plenty of headroom left just in case. Bone Lab seems to be one of those games that people either love or hate, and hey, I find myself somewhere in the middle, but that is neither here nor there. We're here to see how the 6950 XT performs in this game, so here we go. With the render resolution at 4704 by 2384 and the refresh rate at 90 Hz, I set the game's graphics quality to the Ultra preset and then turned MSAA to 1x and disabled SMAA. At these settings, our performance headroom in this game was right on the edge, but for the most part, the 6950 XT delivered a constant 90 FPS. There were times, however, the compositor would cut our frame rate in half for reasons I don't fully understand, because usually this happens when the performance headroom drops below 0. But as you can see on the graph, our performance headroom remained more or less the same, but the frame rate would drop for a bit and then come back. Again, I'm not entirely sure why this was happening, and I'm not going to pretend like I do, because I don't. Maybe one of you out there watching knows what's causing this and can help us out. Other than those occasional hiccups though, the game looked sharp and ran smooth at these settings with the 6950 XT. Keeping our render resolution at 4704 by 2384 and the refresh rate at 90 Hz, the 6950 XT delivered great performance in Lone Echo 2. In the game's graphic settings, I set the resolution scale to 110%, multi-sample anti-aliasing to none, temporal AA to disabled, and all other settings to their maximum values. Looking at the performance graphs, you can see the 6950 XT was able to maintain a constant 90 FPS at these settings. Looking at the performance headroom, though, you can see we were right on the edge, pushing the 6950 XT right to its limits. In most areas of the game, the 6950 XT had just enough horsepower to keep our frame rate above 90 FPS with the settings I went with. But there were some areas like this one here where the GPU got pushed a little too far and the compositor did its job and cut our frame rate in half to keep things running smoothly. As soon as I moved out of these areas, though, our frame rate came right back, and thankfully, Lone Echo 2 is a fairly slow-paced game, so even in moments like those, you don't really notice the drop in frame rate. This game is absolutely gorgeous, and at these settings, the graphics in the headset looked amazing, and gameplay was smooth. For The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners, I kept the refresh rate at 90 Hz and the render resolution at 4704 by 2384. I set the pixel density in the game to 140%, turned anti-aliasing off, and all other graphical settings to ultra, and the 6950 XT was easily able to maintain a 90 FPS frame rate with the performance headroom typically hovering between 40 and 50%. Every time I'd fight a walker, though, the frame rate would drop, even though our performance headroom was still well above zero. Just like with Bone Lab, I'm not entirely sure why this is happening. Had I not had the performance graphs right in front of my face, though, feeding me this information, I don't know that I would have even noticed the frame rate drops. This game is fairly slow-paced, so things still felt smooth to me. At these settings, this game looks really good, and other than the frame drops when killing walkers, the 6950 XT had no problem at all running it. As of right now, Microsoft Flight Simulator is the ultimate GPU test. To see just how the 6950 XT would handle it, I left the render resolution at 4704 by 2384, but decided to lower the refresh rate to 72 Hz because this game is just a beast. In the VR graphics settings in Flight Simulator, I turned anti-aliasing off, set render scaling, world scale, level of terrain detail, and objects level of detail all to 100, and every other setting to its lowest value, and turned off those that were able to be turned off. At these settings, Flight Simulator looks better than I was expecting it to. Having the render resolution at 4704 by 2384 made the graphics look sharp, and all the instruments and stuff in the plane looked great. The buildings and stuff on the ground obviously weren't as detailed, but having tested this game with other GPUs, the 6950 XT impressed me with this performance. In this training flight over Sedona, Arizona, as long as I didn't move my head too quickly, the frame rate stayed right at 72 FPS, which made for a very smooth experience. I, of course, had to take a flight over New York City to see just how the 6950 XT would handle that, and as expected, the frame rate was cut in half. But for the most part, that 36 FPS was unwavering, so while the frame rate was noticeably low, it didn't make me feel sick at all because the frame times were consistent and motion felt relatively smooth. I'm looking forward to and hoping I can get my hands on a 7900 XTX when they launch because I'd love to see what it's capable of in this game. And if you're with me on this, let's see how many heck yeahs we can get in the comments. Saving VR's best game for last, it's time to look at Half Life Alyx. Once again, I set the render resolution in the Oculus app to 4704 by 2384 and the refresh rate to 90 Hz. In Half Life Alyx, I used the Ultra Fidelity preset in the performance options, and as you probably could have guessed, the 6950 XT performed really well. The graphics looked incredible, and as you can see from the frame rate and performance headroom graphs, the game ran very nicely as well. Now, circling back to our question at the beginning of the video, can the 6950 XT play VR games with all these settings maxed out? As I'm sure you already knew, it depends on the game. It's definitely capable of delivering excellent performance in any game, and if you prefer playing at a higher refresh rate than I did in some of these tests, you can always lower the resolution a little bit or lower other settings to hit your target frame rate.